I wanted to tell you a little story that is consistent with what Patty earlier talked about on the issue of honesty, because I've been the victim of some of the dishonest campaigns. And so a number of years ago, when I was a postdoctoral candidate or a postdoctoral fellow at University of California, Berkeley, and not surprisingly, Berkeley is a hotbed of a lot of interesting free speech and movements that sometimes fall into the category of radical. There was a demonstration against biomedical research by a group called In Defense of Animals. It was run by a person named Dr. Katz, no relation, thankfully. And they used these photographs. One of the photographs was Domitian, the primate you saw in the monkey chair a little bit earlier this morning. And I called him up on the phone, and they had other photographs where we knew that the photographs were dishonest representations of anything that had actually occurred. And I called him and said, Dr. Katz, I'm a resident of this area of Berkeley. I see your demonstration, and I'm listening to the talks that your people are giving. But the photographs and the things that you're saying don't seem to square up with the truth. And I went into some detail about what the photographs were, and he didn't know my particular position at the time. And he went on to tell me that honesty doesn't work in their campaign. They need to be sensational in order to get the attention of the press, in order to get people to listen to them. And so their cause was more important than the truth. I sat on the phone rather stunned, and then realized that we have a lot of work ahead of us if in fact, the opponents don't think that the truth is as important as their cause. So another story occurred just a couple of years ago in New Jersey when I was involved with issues related to management of white-tailed deer populations. And the same groups who are accusing us of abusing animals in all sorts of our daily lives had written a letter to the editor of the Asbury Park Press, a widely circulated newspaper in Central and South Jersey and along the coastal areas. And in that letter to the editor, they accused me of belonging to this nefarious group, NAIA, who has, as one of its prime activities, suing groups who are out there doing the good work of trying to prevent us from abusing animals, which of course is a bald-faced lie. That's, as Patty went through the important activities of our group, suing other groups is not really something that we're particularly interested in doing. Okay, well that was bad enough, letters to the editor disappear in time, people's memories are short, and a few weeks later, the Star Ledger, which is the statewide newspaper of New Jersey, comes out one morning. I'm having my coffee, and I see my name on the editorial page. And in this case, the editorial said, according to the Asbury Park Press, Katz is involved in this group that does these things. And I thought, well, wait a second. What an interesting way to tell a lie here. Because the editorial boards of newspapers don't ground truth any of the editorial letters. If you put your name and contact information, they'll print anything you say. So it's very easy to get lies out there. And when you're the target of one of those lies, it's particularly disturbing. So we have the technology. I'm hoping that you can read some of the red. There's not a whole lot of red, so I think it won't be too much of a problem as we proceed. I did want to say something about NAIA. I've been associated with this group. Actually, I've lost track of how many years it's been now, Patty. I started with an organization in Berkeley that was primarily looking at biomedical research and the claims that were made against us, and quickly learned that it didn't matter whether you were raising animals for food, whether you were breeding animals, whether you were showing animals in circuses or using animals for any other activity. You were up against the same sorts of false accusations and claims, so that we needed to unite together. So at Berkeley, we formed a group called Coalition for Animals and Animal Research. Not coincidentally, we tried to ally ourselves, or we did ally ourselves with the incurably ill for for research. Shortly thereafter, I became involved with a group called the American Animal Welfare Foundation. And it was at that time that I heard of the work that Patty and Rod were doing, and we made our connections. And I think it's been a pretty nice run in the last few years as we've really gained a lot of attention around the country for the work that we do on behalf of all of us who have an interest in a lifestyle that includes animals. And our lifestyle with animals has a rather long and interesting history, and that's what I want to talk about today, is the history of the relationship between people and animals. And so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the idea of domestication, because we think of animal domestication as something that we've sort of consciously done, but really the change in human behavior and human society depended a lot on our relationship with animals in both an informal and a formal sense. So I want to talk about spend some time to talk about domestication. I never fail to get up here and let people know that while I'm not a breeder, because I leave that to the people who really know what they're doing, I'm a great enthusiast and have been my entire life of the German Shepherd breed. And I put this picture up here to show you some of the changes that have taken place over the last 125 years for this relatively young breed. Up in the upper left-hand corner is Horand, who was actually born with the name Hector. But when Max von Stephanitz purchased this animal, who he thought represented some of the skills and that he was looking for in the perfect dog, he renamed him Horand, who became the first registered German Shepherd dog in Germany. And after about 115 years of selection, the photograph on the lower right is the most recent national champion in the breed. So you can see there have been some rather dramatic changes. Some would argue that some of those changes have led to some problems. Others would argue that it has given the function of this herding dog greater stamina. And I think that in some cases both people are maybe right. It's all about the care that the breeders take in the careful selection of animals and the decisions that one makes about breeding the breeding stock, and who makes those careful decisions and has the information at their fingertips to make those very difficult and careful decisions. The purebred breeders, such as many of you in this room right now, who have the knowledge, the skills, the motivation, the insanity to do this kind of work. Of course, our relationship with animals of many kinds extends for centuries. This is my grandnephew, by the way, with one of my non-German Shepherd companions, my golden retriever. And we have had this long history with dogs, and today dogs continue to be an important part of our families around the world, but especially in the U.S. I think Patty's numbers that showed the high proportion of families with animals remains very high. If you extend beyond the dogs to cats and other animals, the percentage of families with animals in the household is very, very high. About 4 years ago, I was teaching a course at Rutgers in the animal science department called Companion Animal Science. And the first day of the lecture, there were 75 students in the classroom. And the first day of the lecture, I said, grab a piece of paper and list the animals that you've had in your lifetime. These are 18, 19-year-old young people. List the animals that you've had in your household, not by name, but what species, whether you had fish or birds, dogs, cats, etc. 75 students. At the end of the day, I collected those papers and then I counted up the different species, and there were over 130 different species of animals that this one group of students had lived with in the past decade or so. A remarkable connection that we have with animals that transcends culture and race and gender and other issues that oftentimes divide us, but in this case bring people together. I don't know how well you can see this photograph. I scanned this or downloaded it from a website from Science Magazine. This is a photograph of a fossil find in near Israel, of a burial site that's 14 or 15,000, well, it says 12,000 years old. Since then, maybe they thought it could be a bit older than that. This burial site shows, obviously, the human skeletal remains lying at rest. This little blur of bones that you probably can't make out very well from your seats are the fossilized remains of a puppy. And the puppy, what you also can't see very well is that one arm of this person was actually cradled around the fossilized remains of the puppy, suggesting that this was not the person's favorite meal, but rather its close associate. And so this relationship between humans and dogs extends. We now know close to 15,000 years of a relationship between people and dogs. There's a lot of interesting research, especially now with the technologies, the genetic technologies we have for tracking the history of dogs, that as well, combined with the archaeological evidence that suggests about a 15,000 year loving relationship between these two species, one that changed both dramatically over time. So to talk about domestication, I'm going to use some terms that come from the field of evolution, and I think it's important that we at least be thinking about this in the same context. So I'm going to give you sort of Bio 101 here for the next few moments on this idea of evolution. And define, really, it is a process by which there is differential representation of each individual in succeeding generations. In other words, there's something about some individuals that allows them to leave more offspring than others. And it's a simple matter then of numbers. If there is a genetic basis to the traits that allows one to reproduce more than another, then those traits will be represented in the next generation. A simple idea. I don't really understand why there's so much controversy about the issue of evolution. It is a fact. It is not a theory. How evolution operates is through this process of natural selection. Leads to evolutionary change only when the difference between individuals reflects a degree of underlying genetic differences. Some species reproduce by asexual means. They just clone themselves through mitotic divisions. And in that case, there is no genetic difference among the populations, and there is no natural selection operating on them. In some environments, that's a very successful strategy because sexual reproduction is very risky, because you take a complex of genes that seems to be working well or has worked well for a long time, and in sexual reproduction, you kind of shuffle the deck, and you don't always end up with the ideal situation. And if you have a non-changing, highly predictable environment, then shuffling the deck might be risky. But most environments are not non-changing and are not entirely predictable. And so what sexual reproduction and then, as a result, natural selection allows for is survival when environments do change, because one genotype that's favored today may not be the one favored tomorrow. Selection operates in a variety of directions or a variety of means, and there are three basic methods of selection: directional selection, stabilizing, and disruptive selection. And in some ways, as we have created breeds of dogs and other species as well, we have imposed an artificial selection process that may use one or more of these separate tools, if you will, or these methods of selection. And I'll take you through each of these in a moment. So the way the selection operates is, again, some individuals will reproduce and some will not. So if you look at any particular trait across a large number of animals, you're likely to find, and there are certainly exceptions to this, a normal distribution or a bell curve, as we describe that, in which the average is in the center here, and a certain fairly large proportion of the population is going to be have the trait relatively close to that midpoint, and then the frequency of individuals at either high end or low end tails off in a stochastic or probabilistic ratio. So you have some measurable trait, and this is a typical starting point for the population. So now if you look at something like a directional selection, at the top, here's our normal distribution, and we have some individuals, a proportion of individuals that fall out in this extreme. And for directional selection, if you now only allow the animals, if only the animals that are out at this end reproduce, what happens is the mean, the average, starts to shift and shift and shift. So the new population has a distribution that is deflected in the direction of the average that was, or the representatives of that extreme. So you have selection operating in a particular select direction. Stabilizing selection can create a situation where the variability in the population becomes narrow. So you see the shape of the bell curve versus the shape of this curve. And in stabilizing selection, what happens is the animals that are at either extreme of the curve do not reproduce. And so as you eliminate some of the variation by animals not reproducing at either end, you end up with a narrower looking distribution. And this is probably something that's quite common in artificial selection regimens, which I'll talk about in a few moments. There's also disruptive selection, and this is an important phenomenon that occurs as new species are being developed, occurs in nature as new species are developing. So in disruptive selection, unlike the prior case where the extremes do not reproduce, in this case, the extremes of the population are favored by the environment. And when the extremes reproduce and the midpoint does not reproduce, you end up splitting the population, the distribution, into two curves deflected towards either end of those extremes. So you see selection can operate to move the traits in a variety of different directions. In this case, what I've been describing is where the environment serves as the selection. That is, where under certain environments, certain individuals within the population breed or don't breed, bringing about these changes. These sorts of changes occur over hundreds to thousands of generations. I don't use years because depending upon the species, the length of a generation varies from minutes to decades. But these kinds of changes can occur over many, many, many generations in all sexually reproducing species. Now we bring humans into play, and that gets at the issue of artificial selection, and this can be taken in a variety of directions as we choose to do so. Here's two sort of classic examples of experiments with where artificial selection, where people chose individuals of a population to reproduce or not reproduce based on the particular traits that the animals exhibited. So on the top panel, it's actually looking at the number of bristles on the abdomen of Drosophila. A nice little experiment to do, if you're a faculty member and you want to get tenure and you got a 6-year clock. You don't want to do this this is 25 generations. You don't want to do this with dogs, right? Because you won't get tenure because your data point will be way back here. But Drosophila, you can have a graduate student do this and get a PhD in 4 or 5 years. So it's a nice little study. But look at this dramatic change in the average trait. In this case, the number of bristles on the Drosophila, just by selecting animals, the animals that had more bristles and allowing them to breed. Detailed work, obviously, looking under a dissecting microscope to count the number of bristles, but you can see it's a trait that was genetically regulated, and you bring about a rather dramatic change. In this case, in a fairly short period of time, but still a fairly large number of generations. Turns out that the 20 to 25 generations is an interesting number because regardless of the generation interval, in many studies that have been done looking at artificial selection and this directional selection, about 20 generations is the period of time where you really start to see some pretty major divergence occurring from the founder populations. Animals are not the only species that we domesticate. In the lower graph, just to remind you that we do this with plants. In fact, we've been doing it with plants. Humans have been doing this with plants longer than we've been doing this with animals. And this shows the percent oil content from corn. If you want to increase the amount of corn oil, you can select the same sort of biological phenomenon in plants as it would be with animals. I'm an animal scientist, and I'm a behaviorist, so I can't help but include a little bit of data that falls into my world. And this is a summary of a body of work done by an investigator named Paul Siegel many years ago to show that behaviors also have a genetic basis to their mechanisms. So what he had done was he started with a flock of chickens, and he gave the young males opportunities to mate with females, and he counted the number of times that they mated in about a 15 or 20 minute period, and then he segregated these animals into what he called the high mating line, they're studs, and the low mating lines, the kind of duds, and then gave each of them opportunities to breed, and then each generation he did the same sort of sorting experiment, and he separated the studs from the duds, and after 20 generations, this is what he found with respect to the frequency with which these animals would mate when given the opportunity to be with females. The high line, so here's the controls. Over 20 generations, it never really changed in this I forget if it was 15 or 20 minutes, the animals would mount, the males would mount the hens about 7 times, they'd have a complete mating about 5 times. But look at the divergence here after 20 generations of selecting the high line from the low line. These duds truly were duds, and the studs were not bad. So here's a behavior that was, in this case, desired. That is, to find those animals who are willing, when placed with females, to do the breeding that's essential for poultry production, and one can in fact produce these high-performing males through selection experiments. Nice set of studies. Published in 1965. I do read current literature as well, but sometimes the work from years ago is of value. Now, I mentioned that because getting grayer and grayer over the years, what I find is that many of my early publications are not in the electronic data retrieval systems. And so when graduate students write a paper and they don't cite my work because they didn't find it on the computer retrieval system, I get annoyed. So let's move now from some of the mechanisms of evolution itself and talk about animal domestication. And I put this, there are many definitions of domestication. This is my favorite one because I helped create it. But more importantly, I think it covers some of the issues that are really important for understanding the changing relationship between humans and animals. And as I give this lecture to my undergraduate students every year, I kind of go through it, and I think there's value to look at it, to break it down and look at it, because truly domestication is a process, and I think it's important that we think of it as a process, because today we continue to change the animals with whom we're interacting. So it's an ongoing, we didn't finish domesticating animals, and our own biology hasn't finished changing as well, so it truly is a biological, constantly changing system. The most important aspect of the domestication, of course, is this adaptation to humans. That animals become adapted to humans, not only to humans, us, but to the environment in which we place the animals. So the animals become adapted to humans and to the captive environment, and then importantly, this relationship involves some genetic changes that I'll talk about momentarily. And these genetic changes must occur over generations. As I've shown you, we've done experimentally to show that we can do this in a controlled way. The interesting thing about most of our current domesticated animals is it was done in a uncontrolled way. We were not biologists or geneticists when we started domesticating animals. We started domesticating animals long before Mendel did his pea experiments to understand anything about genetics. But we did understand something about the relationship that we could have with some animals, and our own social systems developed in a way that our association with animals led to genetic changes over generations, and I'll talk about that momentarily as well. The interesting aspect of domestication that is in the last part of this sentence has to do with this recurring environmental exposure to humans that occurs generation after generations in animals. And many of the earlier definitions of domestication really ignored the idea that there are non-genetic changes that take place as well. Beautiful, beautiful work on the socialization of dogs by Scott back in the 60s also, and Scott and Fuller, that showed that this early socialization period, this early developmental period for dogs, first 6 weeks of life or so, in which their contact with humans and their contact with other dogs has a dramatic impact on their lifelong behavior, interaction with both humans and dogs, helps them affiliate and associate with, identify who they are. Am I a dog or am I a person? What am I? And these are not genetic changes, they're developmental changes, but interestingly, over generation and generation of breeding dogs, we know give these animals certain kinds of exposures during this early period in life, and this brings about these kinds of changes that are encompassed by the idea of domestication. Over the centuries, we've had both successes and failures at domesticating a number of different species, and there are reasons why successes occur, and there are reasons why failures take place. And many of the explanations fall into the natural, understanding something about the natural behaviors, social systems, feeding, reproduction, etc., of
the native or the non-domesticated species. There are certain traits that animals contain or possess that make them more likely to be successfully domesticated or not. In other words, either capable of remaining healthy and reproducing in the presence of humans, or being easy enough to care for by humans. And these traits are considered pre-adaptations to domestication. They're not requirements for domestication, because if we look through this list, we will find that, in fact, there are successes in domestication where an animal may or may not have one or other of these pre-adaptations. But when we step back and look at the successes in domestication, what we find is those animals that have been domesticated have more rather than few of these pre-adaptations. So docility, well, you can well imagine the problems that might have occurred in primitive humans trying to domesticate, saber-toothed tigers or animals of that nature, rather dangerous. So the big, slow-moving grass eaters were probably a whole lot easier to deal with than some of the predatory species. Generalist feeders, once we started moving animals around, and an animal that would have a very specialized diet would be very difficult for humans to deal with. So most of the domesticated species would pretty much eat, not that they're omnivores, but that within the class, whether they're omnivores, carnivores, or herbivores, they would have sort of a wide diet across that spectrum. Social animals. I remember an interesting talk years ago from a scientist in Canada who had a company in which they were doing some molecular biology to put the gene that creates spider silk into the milk, into the mammary gland of goats. And the idea was, from the goat milk, then you could spin that spider web and create an incredibly strong material. Spider silk is about 1,000 times, has the tensile strength about 1,000 times greater than silk. And he joked and he said, well, why go through all this work to put that gene into goats? Why don't we just raise spiders? And he says, well, there's a great idea, because at night you have your colony of spiders and you go to bed and you wake up in the morning and you have one spider left. The biggest, baddest, meanest spider. So you need animals that are going to get along in order for you to have a successful long-term relationship with individuals within that group. Mating systems become important because often the humans were making choices about who is or is not in that group, and if you have animals that form strong, let's say, monogamous relationships with one another, and there are species like that, geese and bears and so on, this becomes a problem. You need animals where the males will mate with any female, and the females will allow any males to mate. And so this promiscuous, which is basically mate, doesn't matter, there's no pair bond form, or polygamous, where at least one male will form harems with others. And this is typically the kinds of mating systems we see in the animals that have been successfully mated. We know there are exceptions, of course. Non-territorial, again, you have difficulties if you're moving your animals. And if you have a territorial species, you have a lot of disruption in the social organization if the territory is moving quite a bit. So in animals that have a social hierarchy, alpha, beta, gamma, etc., wherever they reside, that social order will be maintained, so you'll have peace in the house. But if you have a territorial animal and you're in location A, the territory holder there is the victor and the winner, and if anybody challenges, there's a fight. Now you move them, and then someone else is now the territorial owner, and they have to reestablish dominance. So you have lots of fighting when you move territorial animals around. One can argue the territoriality issues with dogs and cats these days, and I'm not convinced that the dogs are territorial. Cats may be more so, but it's of a temporal nature, perhaps more than a spatial relationship. And the ecological flexibility is very important. These animals need to be able to live, survive, and reproduce in a variety of environmental climes. So these are just a few of the examples, and there's a longer list I could go through, but I won't, of the traits of animals that facilitate domestication and turn out. Again, much of this we look at retrospectively. These are the traits that are present in those animals where we have successfully domesticated. And there are many examples on the African continent in particular where attempts at domesticating some of the large hoofed stock, some of the large ungulates have failed, in large part because the animals were not particularly tractable. They were so athletic, agile, they would escape enclosures. In some cases, the nature of their weaponry was the horns and whatnot made them dangerous to be around. So there are many failures, and those examples of failures can usually be explained by the nature of some of their preadaptations. Moose, for example, are highly specialized feeders and very difficult to do any long-term controlled work with them when you have a specialized feeder. So historically, investigators in the area of animal domestication have kind of looked at the stages of our relationship with these animals that we've domesticated. And these stages were sort of broken into 5 areas. It's sort of a temporal categorization, and also looks at sort of the development of human social systems along with the changing relationship that we had with animals over this period of time. And so I'll take you through these stages to give you a sense of what may have been occurring. Now, bear in mind that some of these are focused a little bit more towards the herbivores, perhaps, than towards the dogs, but many of the issues may pertain as well. So initially, of course, there were the sort of loose ties where we were living was close to where certain animals were living, and especially where when you look at some of the large herbivores, we would move with the animals, the animals move where the food's available, and those moving animals were food for us, and therefore we moved in order to stay where the game animals were. Turns out we learned a lot about the behavior of these animals, and in so doing, and our hunting strategies became modified and sophisticated in order to be more successful. One of the innovations, if you will, that made us very successful was wolves like to eat the same things that we did. And wolves are very good at chasing prey, fatiguing them, but they're not necessarily the most efficient at killing. Humans, on the other hand, had developed some pretty effective weapons that they could use in a projectile nature, or at least have a pretty good kill rate. And so probably in very early period of time, the wolves learned that there might be some good food available if you don't go too far from where people are. And at the same time, the people probably learned that these predators, while maybe initially we think they're competing for those same food supplies, they're actually helping us round up some of these animals that we want to kill. So we probably began provisioning the wolves by leaving behind the entrails and other components of the killed animals that then provided some benefit to the wolves to be in association with us. So there may have been some gradual change in the behavior and even the genetics. Those wolves who could tolerate the presence of humans were maybe more successful because of their association with humans. One could argue that those humans who tolerated the presence of the wolves might have been more successful hunters, and perhaps the evolution of humankind is influenced by that relationship as well, too. Pure speculation. I love to do that. In time, we began to control the breeding and prevent interbreeding with wild forms. Now, this was an interesting innovation by humans because we didn't understand very much about reproduction. In fact, it's fairly modern history before we even made the connection between sex and reproduction. And so, yet, we did recognize early on that the offspring of animals look an awful lot like their parent. And so, in choosing animals that would be part of the group, there may have been some, what we sometimes call unconscious selection for different phenotypes, the appearance, the morphology, the behavior of the animals that became more successful in close association with humans. We also realized that if there was a lot of interbreeding with the wild type, the animals that had not been breeding in close association with us, it sort of set back the kinds of changes that we were seeing. The horns got bigger, the speed got faster, the docility got less, and so we began to close animals, try to separate animals off from the wild forms. But yet there was still a fair amount of interbreeding with the wild. We weren't perfect at the housing. It's an important point for me to highlight that even once we started controlling who bred and who did not breed, there was still a lot of interbreeding with the wild forms at the time. That turns out to be extremely important when we look at the genetic diversity present in dogs. That, as I'll talk about what we think we know about the domestication of the dog, this genetic variability, great genetic variability, probably comes from the fact that there continued to be a lot of outbreeding with wolves even after the domestication had begun. There's pretty good evidence that there was intentional interbreeding at some point with the wild forms as well. One of the natures of domestication, and along with the docility, was a reduction in size. So once we had the livestock and other animals that were a little easier to care for, a little smaller, didn't eat as much, we started to get a little more sophisticated by allowing controlled interbreeding with the wild types, which could then bring the size of the domesticated stocks a little bit higher. Again, much of these, the sort of understanding of this history is an interesting challenge to really geographers who did describe much of this work. So there's a certain amount of archaeological evidence, but behavior of human groups is not saved in the fossil record, of course. But what is saved in the record is the history and the memories of subsistence groups, of ancient cultures. And for many, many years, geographers have talked to groups in a variety of places around the world about their current, at the time, their current relationship and history with animals. And from that, the speculation and the hypotheses are developed that address how we may have interacted with animals at a much earlier time. So it's an interesting field of study because there's not hard and fast scientific data, but there's some pretty good cultural accountings, ethnographic accounts. It's actually fascinating reading to spend some time in the library and read some of these anthropological and ethnographic accounts of these primitive societies. They're remarkably talented. I always wondered if I found myself on some deserted island somewhere, if I could survive, and I've got bad news for myself. I'm not nearly as clever as many of these people. So the selection piece is again rather interesting because we started selecting for particular traits and started to develop breeds. We didn't necessarily understand the biology all that well, but we did understand that the offspring looked like their parents, and so the selection had begun really by choosing animals having animals around us that met certain kinds of expectations. When I think about cattle domestication, for example, that was really for religious purposes, and there were certain cattle that sort of typified the kind of traits that certain cultures thought were most desirable. Males were expected to be big and strong, and their horns were expected to look like the crescent moon. It turns out that in parts of India, the cattle were considered to be the moon god in animal form. And so the more closely these animals were met, in particular the horns, resembled the crescent horn of the crescent moon, the more desired they were and the more likely they were to be kept rather than eaten. And there are cultures across Africa that have looked at the behavior of different cattle, and they work very closely with these animals, and the selection, again, without taking Bio 101, 102, these groups have learned quite a bit about changing the morphology, the phenotype of their animals. Humans are very protective of their possessions, and so there are a few species where the ancestors remain. The risk of losing all that work led to, in some cases, some rather concerted, intentional campaigns to eliminate the wild ancestors of many of our domesticated species in order to preserve the domestic stocks. But fortunately, there are some exceptions to this, and as it turns out, the dog is one of those exceptions. Not that there wasn't an effort to wipe out wolves for the bad press they get. I think a lot of human behavior sometimes comes from myth, whether it's the notion of this evil wolf. You know, there are very few real cases of wolf attacks on people, but there is that fear, and I sometimes think it's from fairy tales. And, just as I think American attitude about animals comes from Walt Disney. So 30 or 40 years or so of publications on the geography and the biology of domestication ignored some aspects of the way animals have changed under really intense human control. And some years ago, an investigator at Davis, Ed Price, who was very interested in this area, coined the term the sixth stage of domestication. And what that was meant to do was to look at how animals under intensive human care have changed in a way where certain natural selection pressures are no longer important because humans have taken over the care or have provided for animals where they once may have provided for themselves. It turned out to be a rather interesting phenomenon for us in animal science for a number of reasons, particularly with respect to breeding, because we've, by providing very controlled breeding environments for animals, we've created a dud phenomenon. I don't have time to talk too much about that today, but there are certain traits that we see in our domesticated animals that have changed, and the explanation seems to be that while it may be an important trait for an animal living on its own, when it's under the care of a human, that trait may no longer be very important. What that can do then is create some interesting variation in the gene pool of the animals who are continuing to be part of the breeding stock, and that raises a lot of interesting opportunities and challenges. So I did promise you that there was some genetics, and so we won't go too deeply into this, but the mechanisms that have brought about the changes in domestication fall into a number of important areas. And I'm presuming we have many breeders in the room, so you're probably familiar with some of these ideas. But inbreeding was probably one of the most important traits or phenomena that brought about rather dramatic changes to the gene pool of animals under domestication, and it results in increased homogeneity, of course, as you breed close relatives. And this poses some interesting problems, but it also presented some most remarkable opportunities, and the work of a knowledgeable breeder who can find these desired traits, but also make the difficult decision that when they realize that there's an individual who's carrying an undesirable trait that then becomes concentrated in that group when they breed them, must make the decision not to breed these animals. Moreover, I know that many of you in this room have made those decisions to not breed the animal, despite the problems that Patty described and the fear that Patty described, for example, with a movie like 101 Dalmatians, where any dog with spots would get bred. And I think the Chihuahuas probably had a problem when one of the Mexican restaurant chains came out with their cute little Chihuahua. But, inbreeding can be a very, very effective tool for bringing about a desired outcome, but has to be used with great care. But early on in the domestication process, the genetic variability was so great that it was a critical piece to the creation of the animals that we see today. Genetic drift is an interesting phenomenon. It occurs when you have a founder population. Think of a bottleneck. And you have a population sitting in this big bottle, and you're only going to breed a few, and so you shake out a few through this narrow bottleneck. And what ends up being poured out of that bottle is sort of random. You shake the bottle, you pour out a few, and you stop. And now your gene pool is sort of randomly narrowed by virtue of the animals that you've selected. When I teach this lecture to my animal science students, I usually look at the front row, and I say, suppose we went to Mars, and I'm taking everyone in the front row. And that will be our founder population for the humans on Mars. And so now let's consider our genetic variability. And the biggest problem I have when I use that example is because of the nature of the gender demographics in animal sciences, there's no men in the front row. So then I say, okay, I'm going to be very busy, but at the end at the end of the day, what are some of the opportunities we're going to have, and what are some of the limitations we're going to have? And oftentimes there are very few redheads, because I don't know if there's any around this room, but you're a minority. And so often, I'll say, do you expect to see any redheads? And we get into a nice discussion about this idea of genetic drift. But that's truly what happened as animals became domesticated. The pool, the founder population is rather limited. Therefore, the gene frequencies are influenced by that founder population. Artificial selection, then, is interesting, and you all know about that because you select animals yourselves. You think about the desirable traits, and you select animals that display those traits, and their offspring look like them sometimes. The interesting thing about artificial selection is sometimes often you don't get, no, I don't want to phrase that. Sometimes you get things you don't expect to get. There's sort of an unconscious, not unconscious, but there's an unexpected result of artificial selection. There are traits that you're interested in, but because of the nature of where those genes may be located on the chromosomes, sometimes other things come along with it. So while you may be selecting for one trait, you may be getting something else as well. Some really beautiful classic work done in rats, for example, again, an animal with a short generation interval, in which the animals were selected for the color of their hair. Turns out, normally a rat has a hair color that's called a agouti. It's a dark, either black or brown hair with a yellow band at the end. It gives them that sort of pretty shimmery look. I know you don't look at rats and think they're pretty, but they are. Animals that don't have that yellow band are considered either black or brown. It's a solid. It's a really, really pretty color. Kind of looks like a rat that looks like it's a mink. Turns out when you select for that non-agouti, that is that black color, you also end up with an animal that's very tame, that's easy to handle. Why? The only explanation really is that the genes underlying this sort of tractability or docility happen to be closely associated with the genes associated with that agouti hair type. There's an interesting selection experiment, too, to determine the docility. I'll just, as an aside, apologize. I'm a professor. I do ramble on. The animals they were trapped in junkyards, and then they were sorted by their hair color, and breeding experiments began, and there was a graduate student who would walk into they would release an animal into a room, and the graduate student had to go in and catch the animal. And there was no furniture or anything in this square room. She just had to start to approach it. Turns out that the animals that had the normal agouti gene would do like any other rat would do, is run away, and they would run into the corner of the room. This is when things got really interesting. So the animals that had the solid black hair would stand there, would kind of hiss and get nervous, and would cower, and then the investigator would walk up. I can't believe she did this study because I would have been scared to do this. These are wild rats. She would walk up and then have to capture it. And meanwhile, the observer was recording how long it would take to do this. The wild type animal would get into the corner, but it didn't cower. It stood up on its hind legs, it hissed, and it started jumping at her. And yet she still had the courage to go up and catch that animal. And it took over 20 generations. The difference between these behavior of these animals was quite remarkable. So that's what's meant by this idea of unconscious selection. So typically it's goal-oriented, but oftentimes there's some baggage that comes along that may be unpredictable. Now, even in a captive environment, there will be environmental factors that can have some differential impact on the animal's health, growth, development, and ultimately reproduction. And so even in captivity, natural selection is still operating. There's genetic variability, and some animals will reproduce at higher rates than others. So natural selection continues to operate even when the animals come under the close care of humans. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a relaxation of natural selection occurs too. Some behaviors lose their adaptive significance. So these are the sort of genetic inputs to the changes under domestication, and over many, many, many years, they compile themselves into a rather interesting outcome. So what's unique about domestication as opposed to evolution is that artificial selection is for specific, often extreme, phenotypic characteristics, and that losses in fitness accompanying artificial selection are frequently negated by the animal management practices. So while some traits may not appear or maybe more difficult to elicit from the animals, humans come in and take over and provide the health care and the breeding and so forth. Food provisioning issues, anti-predator behaviors, a number of things that humans do then become an issue that is under human control. Also eliminated is much of the within the species competition for resources. Again, changing the nature of some of the behaviors expressed by these animals. 40, maybe 50 years of captive breeding of foxes in Russia have really demonstrated some really nice examples of the kinds of changes that we see in other domesticated species in terms of the retention of juvenile characteristics. Seems to be one of these traits that comes across in many of our domesticated species. Play behavior, the vocalization behaviors, a variety of traits that are often seen in the wild animals in their juvenile stage, but then tend to disappear as they mature, remain within domestic animals. Barking in dogs, I think, is a classic example of that. Wolves don't bark a whole lot, but the pups do an awful lot of yapping. A number of cognitive mechanisms that may have been altered because of humans. The other interesting piece about domestication is, for many years there were those in the sort of American Psychological Association, if you will, that is the psychologists, comparative psychologists, who poo-pooed any work with domesticated animals because they felt they were degenerate. They don't express normal behaviors, and therefore domestication has created this oddity. Turns out they weren't really looking things particularly carefully. What changed is not necessarily the ability of the animal to express a behavior, but rather the nature of the kinds of environments or stimuli that would elicit the behavior. Again, I'll give you another example that comes from domesticating rats because of the nice work that's been done with controlled breeding, starting with wild rats. Rats are burrowers, and when wild rats are captured and brought into a laboratory, and in the old days, the NIH requirements, actually these days as well, all the cages were solid-bottomed with pine shavings, typically pine shavings in it, and the wild rats would immediately burrow under the shavings, and you would find them, other than when the lights go off when they're active, they would be under the shavings. But the domesticated rats tended to stay on top of the shavings, and so the notion was domestication has eliminated the burrowing behavior. It's a nice series of studies out of SUNY Albany where wild enclosures were built for the rats to maintain. And what they found is that if you look at the location of the burrow, it's not random in the environment. It usually is under some kind of a ledge, a downed tree, a big rock. So there's some sort of surface, and the animals burrow against this vertical surface and create the hole. So the investigator said, gee, what would happen if I put a brick in the cage with the domesticated rats, with the lab rats? So he takes the cage, puts the brick in there, and lo and behold, within moments, the rats come up to the edge, that vertical surface, the lab rats come up, and they burrow, and they go under that ring. So they didn't lose the ability to burrow. Domestication didn't cause them to lose the ability to burrow, but rather what domestication does is change the nature, the intensity of some kinds of environmental stimuli that now elicit that behavior. So we change the animals, but we don't necessarily lose traits. It becomes kind of a quantitative variation. The single most important characteristic seen for domestic animals is this reduced responsiveness to changes in the environments. Okay, they tend to be more placid. They tend to be a little more easier going. They're not so hypersensitive to what's going on, which is the reason why they reproduce in captivity successfully. Those who are hyper by being in a controlled environment, maybe densely populated environment that included people, clearly that stress would have inhibited their reproductive output, and they would not have been successfully kept in captivity. I'm running late, so I'm going to jump through some of these ideas and get to a little bit of the dog. I promised we'd talk a little bit about the dog. So a number of genetic tools have been brought to bear on trying to understand something about genetic diversity and genetic variability among dogs. And there are many ways that one can go about looking at genetics, because certainly it's located in the nucleus of the cell, where in theory, half of your genes come from your mother and half of your genes come from your father. And that leads to lots of opportunities. But another place where genes are located and where genetic material is located is within the mitochondria. And the interesting thing about the mitochondria is you only get them from one place. You don't get any mitochondria from your father. All you're getting from your father is the genetic material located in the nucleus of a sperm cell. But the oocyte, mother's contribution, contains genetic material within the mitochondria. And so tracking some of the genetic changes and variability along from mitochondria can tell you something about, more about the lineage of the genetics. And so many of the current studies looking at trying to understand where domestication may have occurred are looking at DNA, microsatellite DNA from mitochondria and other components, other DNA material within the cytoplasm. The archaeology, boiling down an awful lot of information from many places around the world, some really nice work out of Sweden, suggests that the domestication of the dog was a single event in East Asia somewhere around 15,000 years ago. But remember what I said earlier, that even after the domestication began, a limited amount of interbreeding with the wild type still was occurring. So even though there was this domestication happening, there was still genetic influx into the population from wolves. And then later, probably at least there's evidence for at least 2 other times in human history where there was crossbreeding with wolves on the European continent. So we have an interesting mix of genetic input into these animals that we now call dogs. Some information. A lot of my slides, thank you AKC, I have liberally stolen from your websites and other information that is instructive and helpful. There's a good reason for my stealing from the AKC. I try to take information from reliable sources. And so here is a definition of breeds. I don't need to spend much time on this other than to point out the picture that suggests something about the genetic variability and the opportunity that selection provides for us to meet the needs of people in a variety of ways to have these companions. There is a long history, in fact, a long recorded history about dogs, and if you're bored one night and want to try to plow your way through some rather interesting reading, you'll read the Book of St. Albans, published in 1486, in which the existing dog breeds were described. And the interesting thing is, while the spellings and the names may be a little bit different today, you see some names in there that look very familiar, don't they? The greyhounds and the terriers and the mastiffs and spaniels and so forth. This is kind of my favorite one down here, the ladies' puppies. From that point, there was quite a proliferation of writing about dogs and what makes up a breed and how the breeds differ and who was regulating the breeding at that time. And so just a little bit of a shopping list of some of the important events that occurred in the dog world in the 16th century. They began to look at functional divisions of some of these breeds in terms of their hunting or herding or other kinds of activities. Linnaeus, many of you who have studied biology may know the naming, the binomial naming system, Homo sapiens, Canis familiaris. Linnaeus, described in the 18th century, described 35 different breeds. By 1791, within the Encyclopedia Britannica, they began to break them up into groups, from sheepdogs, hounds, spaniels, etc. And then a little bit later, Baron Cuvier began to break up the groups based on morphological classifications, tried to put a bit of a biological and genetic spin. Or it's around that same time that Buffon had published this diagram that represented the relationships of the breeds. You don't need to necessarily read the specific breeds here, but the idea is that he tried to trace the lineage of a number of the existing breeds through their morphological and behavioral similarities to create these clusters of different kinds of breeds. In case you're interested here, number 1 is the bulldog. kind of running out of time, but it's okay because I'm sort of coming up against some of the points that I would make that would only restate some of the things that Patty so nicely described already. A little bit of the history, though, about the first dog show in Britain. We do have representatives of the UKC. I'm glad I included some of this in there. 1843, an exhibition of spaniels. There's some really interesting, the old literature is really nice to read sometimes because the publishers of journals and books were not so stingy with the way they would publish people's work, and so you get some very colorful language in many of the early studies. And now journal editors are like, just stay on the point, and minimize the number of pages for you publish things. I like the way things were done in a different age. The Kennel Club was formed in 1873. Generated its first stud book, and I think it's once these stud books were being formed that some rather dramatic and important changes began within the dog world because of the now a conscious effort to think about the quality of the animals that are being bred and to understand what was being done. Registration rules then were enacted that put some framework around these breeding programs. In the New World, it was a few years later, the American Kennel and Sporting Field Club began, National American Kennel Club in 1876, and published their stud book by 1879, and a few years later, 1884, the American Kennel Club was born. And the growth of the interest in dogs and the sophistication applied to breeding from that point was dramatic. By the way, if you want to read a really interesting book about dogs, this book by Bell and others, The Dog and Its Genome, has some really incredible material about these animals. This is, sorry I didn't have a nice graph like this of data more recent than 2004, but my guess is, while there might be a few little place shuffling in terms of registrations, the Labrador the retrievers, Labradors and Goldens, are representing almost just those breeds themselves are representing almost 20% of the registered dogs. And German Shepherd's always perennial, top 5, top 10, somewhere in that neighborhood, working its way through the most popular breeds, and then 139 other breeds representing about 37% of the registered dogs 7 or 8 years ago. As you know, the formation of the breed clubs were developed to promote the working, showing, and breeding of purebred dogs to maintain quality. This is, I think, the point that we want to be able to tell the public when they talk about purebred dogs. How do you maintain the quality of the dog? You have a group of people who dedicate themselves to understanding what is the quality, what are the health issues, how do we maintain these lines. Breed club genomics research to understand some of the material that I just briefly covered in terms of where dogs come from and what the genetic variability issues may be. Promote the genetic testing. You saw the long list of the genetic testing that's currently being done, and that list will grow the more we're willing to fund research to try to understand the causes of some of the problems in these beloved animals. The establishment of health registries. I remember as a high school student, my interest in hip dysplasia because of my interest in German Shepherds and having my first Shepherd having its hips x-rayed, and the results were not so good. But I'm talking about in the late 60s. Now, since that time, I find that the likelihood that the breeder, German Shepherd breeders, having their dogs x-rayed, their hips, their elbows x-rayed, is at a much, much higher frequency. So I was going to run through some of the breed groups and talk a little bit about the specific breeds, but I've more than used up my allotted time. But in the interest of showing some really pictures and reminding you that I have liberally stolen from the American Kennel Club, I will kind of just show you. Yeah, you can't really see the pictures very well, but it gives you a little bit of the variety of these tremendous animals, the sporting animals, the hounds, the working groups, the terriers, the toy groups. Nothing like keeping your bed nice and warm. There's a little poodle that I babysit for frequently. The owners are professional dancers, and when they go on a competition, I get Benji. He's about 8-pound poodle, sweetheart, intelligent, and he loves to drive with me when I go to work, and I let him sit on my lap. I don't tell the owners that I let him do that. They think he's in the carrier. But he stands on my left leg and he looks out the window. And my car is a standard transmission, so every time I step on the clutch, my leg comes down and his head drops below the window. And then as I let out the clutch, his head comes back. But he's got this fantastic balance and strength, and he just likes going for that ride up and down. And the only drawback to that is that my window has a vertical smear on it as his nose goes up and down. The non-sporting dogs. And then my favorite, of course, notice, see if there was time. Oh, look at it. German Shepherd was bolded here. I don't know. And the miscellaneous class, an interesting area. I'd like to learn more, actually, about how dogs go from becoming sort of a developing breed to becoming a breed. But there's some very interesting animals, I think, out there that people are still working on meeting a particular need. It's just a wonderful science hobby, love. So, again, thank you very much for your attention. And if